The ship that could not be sunk, Bismarck. May 18, 1941. Gotenhafen Harbor, occupied Poland. The largest warship in the world was preparing to leave port for the first and last time. She was 823 feet long. She displaced 50,000 tons fully loaded. Her main battery consisted of 8 15-inch guns arranged in 4 twin turrets, each gun capable of firing a shell weighing nearly 800 kilograms to a distance of 36 kilometers. Her armor belt, the steel protecting her engine rooms and magazines, was 320 millimeters thick at its thickest point. Her anti-aircraft armament alone would have equipped a destroyer. She carried a crew of 2,200 men. Her name was Bismarck, and the German Navy had built her to do one thing: break into the Atlantic, destroy the convoys supplying Britain, and strangle the island nation that stood between Hitler and total European domination. The British knew she was coming. They had been tracking her movements through intelligence reports, aerial reconnaissance, and the network of agents and observers that British intelligence had deployed across occupied Europe. When Bismarck sailed from Gotenhafen with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen on May 18, the Royal Navy began one of the most intense ship hunts in naval history. What followed over the next 9 days was a story of extraordinary violence, extraordinary seamanship, extraordinary bad luck, and extraordinary courage on both sides. A story that ended with 2,200 men at the bottom of the Atlantic and a question that naval historians are still debating: was the Bismarck actually unsinkable? The answer, it turned out, was complicated. The ship and the strategy. To understand why the Bismarck mattered so much, why the British committed the bulk of their home fleet to hunting a single warship, you have to understand the strategic situation of Britain in the spring of 1941. Britain was an island nation fighting a continental war. Everything it needed, food, fuel, raw materials, military equipment from America under the Lend-Lease program that had just begun, arrived by sea. The Atlantic lifeline was not merely important to Britain's war effort. It was the war effort. Cut the convoys, and Britain starved. Starved Britain, and the last significant military power opposing Germany in the West collapsed. The German Navy understood this. Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, had been arguing since before the war that the decisive theater for Germany was the Atlantic, that submarines and surface raiders operating against British shipping could win the war more cheaply and more quickly than any land campaign. The U-boat campaign was already underway and was inflicting serious damage on Allied shipping. The surface raider component, large warships breaking into the Atlantic to attack convoys directly, was the second prong of the strategy. Operation Rheinübung, Rhine exercise, was the plan that sent Bismarck and Prinz Eugen into the Atlantic in May 1941. The plan called for the two ships to break through the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, avoiding British patrols, and then ranging freely through the Atlantic convoy routes, where their speed and firepower would make them essentially immune to anything short of a major British naval force. A convoy escort of destroyers and perhaps a light cruiser could not fight the Bismarck. The convoys would be defenseless. The man commanding the operation was Admiral Gunther Lütjens, a serious, professional naval officer who had concerns about the mission from the beginning. He had wanted to wait until the battleship Tirpitz was ready to accompany Bismarck, doubling the force and making the operation far more viable. He had been overruled. He went anyway, carrying doubts that he expressed in private and suppressed in public. Captain Ernst Lindemann commanded Bismarck itself. He was an experienced officer, popular with his crew, a man who understood his ship intimately. The relationship between Lütjens and Lindemann was professional but not warm. They disagreed on tactical questions throughout the brief operation, and the disagreements would have consequences. The crew of 2,200 men, many of them young, some of them on their first significant sea voyage, sailed from Godenhafen with the confidence that came from serving on the most powerful warship in the world. They had been trained exhaustively. Their ship was magnificent. They were ready. The Denmark Strait, Hood's last minutes. The British were waiting. The Royal Navy had established a watch on the likely exit routes from the North Sea, and when aerial reconnaissance confirmed on May 21 that Bismarck and Prinz Eugen had left port and were heading north, Admiral John Tovey dispatched forces to cover the Denmark Strait and the Iceland-Faroes Passage, the two most likely routes into the Atlantic. The Denmark Strait was covered by two British ships, the heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk and the heavy cruiser HMS Suffolk. When Bismarck and Prinz Eugen entered the strait on the evening of May 23, Suffolk made radar contact and began shadowing the German ships, reporting their position to the main British force closing from the south. Racing to intercept were the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the brand-new battleship HMS Prince of Wales. Hood was one of the most famous warships in the Royal Navy, a battlecruiser of 48,000 tons, fast and impressively armed, whose silhouette was recognized worldwide as a symbol of British naval power. She was also, by 1941, an aging ship whose design reflected the priorities of the First World War rather than the Second. Her deck armor, the horizontal protection against shells falling from a steep angle at long range, was inadequate by 1941 standards, a known weakness that had been scheduled for correction in a refit that the war had prevented. The engagement began at 5:52 a.m. on May 24. The two forces were closing at a combined speed of nearly 60 knots. Hood opened fire first, targeting what her commander Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland believed was Bismarck, actually Prinz Eugen, which led the German formation and whose distinctive silhouette had confused British identification. Bismarck and Prinz Eugen returned fire with their full main batteries. At 6 a.m., 8 minutes after the battle began, a German shell struck Hood near her mainmast and detonated inside the ship. The explosion that followed was not a fire. It was an instantaneous detonation of Hood's after magazine, the compartment containing hundreds of tons of propellant charges for the aft guns. The entire rear section of the ship disappeared in a column of flame and smoke that rose thousands of feet into the morning sky. The bow section remained afloat for perhaps 3 minutes before sinking. Of Hood's crew of 1,418 men, 3 survived. The rest, 1,415 men, died in the explosion or drowned in the freezing waters of the Denmark Strait in the minutes before any rescue could reach them. The shock of Hood's loss reverberated through the Royal Navy and through Britain within hours. Hood had been the pride of the fleet, the ship that had shown the flag around the world for 2 decades, the most recognizable symbol of British naval power. She was gone in 8 minutes. The signal that reached the Admiralty was brief and devastating: Hood has blown up. Winston Churchill's response was immediate and personal. Every available ship of the Royal Navy was to find Bismarck and sink her. Not neutralize her, not capture her, sink her. The destruction of Hood demanded a response that left no ambiguity about the Royal Navy's ability to protect Britain and avenge its losses. The hunt intensified. The lucky hit that decided everything. Prince of Wales, continuing the engagement after Hood's destruction, scored several hits on Bismarck before being forced to disengage by damage to her own fire control systems. She was a brand new ship whose civilian technicians were still aboard working on unresolved mechanical issues when the battle began. But the hits she scored on Bismarck would prove decisive in ways that were not immediately apparent. 2 of Prince of Wales's shells had hit Bismarck's bow section. One of them had penetrated a forward fuel tank and caused flooding that forced the ship to steer with a list and reduce her speed. More critically, the shell had punctured fuel oil tanks in a way that left Bismarck trailing a visible oil slick and, more importantly, unable to transfer fuel from the damaged forward tanks. Bismarck had sailed with her full fuel load, but a significant proportion of it was now inaccessible or leaking into the sea. Lutyens faced a decision. Bismarck was damaged. Her fuel state was compromised. Continuing into the Atlantic to raid convoys was no longer viable. She would run out of fuel before she could complete the mission and return to port. His options were to turn back toward Germany or Norway, or to make for a French port, St. Nazaire on the Atlantic coast, where dry dock facilities could repair the damage. He chose St. Nazaire. It was the decision that sealed Bismarck's fate. The Royal Navy now knew their quarry's destination. The entire Atlantic became a funnel pointing toward the French coast, and every available British warship was positioned to intercept a ship moving through that funnel. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the full weight of the Royal Navy's Atlantic resources was directed toward a single point. Bismarck nearly escaped anyway. On the evening of May 24, in deteriorating weather and gathering darkness, Lutyens detached Prinz Eugen and ordered her to continue into the Atlantic alone. Then he turned Bismarck back toward the British shadowing cruisers in an aggressive maneuver that forced them to break off. In the confusion and the darkness, Bismarck disappeared. For more than 30 hours, the most hunted ship in the world was lost, somewhere in the vast North Atlantic, heading for France, while the Royal Navy searched frantically for her position. The search was desperate. If Bismarck reached St. Nazaire, she could be repaired and returned to service. The psychological and strategic damage of a ship that had destroyed Hood and then escaped to fight again would be severe. Churchill's order was explicit. She must not reach port. She was found again at 10:30 a.m. on May 26 by a Catalina flying boat from the Royal Air Force Coastal Command, operating at the extreme limit of its range, whose American co-pilot spotted the oil slick trailing behind the German ship. The position was transmitted. The net began to close. But Bismarck was now within 700 miles of the French coast. If she could maintain her speed for another day, she would be within range of Luftwaffe air cover and within easy reach of the port. The only British heavy ships that could intercept her were the carrier HMS Ark Royal and the battlecruiser HMS Renown. Renown was not powerful enough to engage Bismarck alone, and Ark Royal's weapon was her aircraft rather than her guns. Ark Royal launched a strike of Swordfish torpedo bombers. The first strike attacked in error. The target was HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser that had been sent ahead to maintain contact with Bismarck. The Sheffield escaped damage only because the magnetic fuses on the torpedoes were defective and most detonated early. The second strike, launched with contact fuses, found Bismarck in the gathering dusk. Of 15 torpedoes launched, 2 hit. 1 amidships, causing no critical damage. 1 in the stern, striking the worst possible location on Bismarck's hull, jamming both rudders hard to port and destroying the steering gear. Bismarck, unable to steer, began turning in circles. She was 700 miles from safety. She could not be guided to port. She could not escape. The ship that had seemed unstoppable was stopped by 2 torpedoes from obsolete fabric and wire biplanes flying at 90 knots. The final battle and the question of sinking. The morning of May 27, 1941, 2 British battleships, HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, closed on Bismarck in gray Atlantic weather and opened fire at 8:47 a.m. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Bismarck's steering was gone. She was making barely 8 knots, turning slowly to port, her crew fighting throughout the night to jury-rig some kind of steering capability and failing. When the British battleships opened fire, she could not maneuver. She could only fight. And fight she did, with a desperation and a professionalism that earned the respect even of the men trying to kill her. Her guns returned fire throughout the engagement, straddling Rodney several times in the early minutes and hitting King George V with splinters. But the incoming fire was overwhelming. Rodney's 16-inch shells, among the largest naval guns in service, struck Bismarck repeatedly on her upper works, destroying her fire control systems, killing men on her decks and in her turrets, silencing her guns one by one. Within an hour, Bismarck was a burning wreck. Her main battery was silent. Her secondary batteries were silent. Her superstructure was destroyed. Fires burned throughout the ship. Men who survived the shellfire were dying from smoke and heat and blast. She was not sinking. Here is the fact that has occupied naval historians ever since. Despite absorbing hundreds of heavy-caliber shells over more than 90 minutes of close-range bombardment, Bismarck was still afloat. Her underwater hull, the armor belt and the watertight compartmentalization below the waterline, had survived everything the British battleships could fire at it. She was a burning hulk, all her military capability destroyed, but she was not sinking. The British ships were running short of fuel. Tovey, the British commander, was forced to consider turning back. He sent the cruiser HMS Dorsetshire to finish the job with torpedoes. Dorsetshire fired 3 torpedoes into Bismarck's hull. She began to sink, but German survivors in the water afterward, and the analysis of the wreck when it was discovered in 1989, suggest that Bismarck's crew opened the sea cocks and scuttled her before Dorsetshire's torpedoes struck her shortly after. The flooding from the scuttling, combined with the torpedo hits, produced the sinking. Whether Dorsetshire's torpedoes alone would have sunk her, or whether, absent scuttling, she might have floated indefinitely as a burned-out hulk, is a question the evidence does not definitively answer. What the wreck does show is remarkable. The external hull is largely intact. The armor belt is unbreached. The magazines did not explode. The underwater compartmentalization held. The ship that was described as unsinkable was not sunk by shellfire. She was sunk by a combination of torpedoes and her own crew's decision to deny her to the enemy. Of 2,200 men, 114 survived, rescued by Dorsetshire before a U-boat alarm forced the cruiser to abandon the rescue. Approximately 2,086 men went down with the ship or died in the water. The British ships that turned away left hundreds of men alive in the sea, a decision that haunted survivors and witnesses for the rest of their lives. What Bismarck's story means. The Bismarck has become, in the 8 decades since her sinking, one of the most mythologized warships in history. The myth has several layers: the invincible ship, the heroic last stand, the tragedy of 2,086 men dying for a mission that was strategically doomed from the beginning. The strategic reality is starker than the myth. Operation Rheinübung was a failure before it began. Even if Bismarck had reached the Atlantic undetected and undamaged, the convoy routes she was sent to ravage were already being rerouted away from areas of surface raider activity. Even if she had sunk convoy after convoy, American shipbuilding capacity was already replacing losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. Even if she had survived and reached Strait, Nazaire, she would have spent most of the war in port, as her sister ship Tirpitz did, too valuable to risk, too vulnerable to air attack to sortie, her deterrent value declining month by month as Allied air power grew. The 2,086 men who died on May 27, 1941, died in a battle whose strategic purpose had already been overtaken by events. Their ship was magnificent. Their courage was real. The cause it served was not. Bismarck lies at the bottom of the Atlantic at a depth of nearly 5,000 meters, where the filmmaker James Cameron and various research teams have visited and photographed her. The wreck shows a ship whose armor did what it was designed to do. Her underwater hull is intact, her compartmentalization held, her magazines did not explode. She was, in the naval engineering sense, genuinely difficult to sink. She was not unsinkable. Nothing is unsinkable. The Hood taught that lesson in 8 minutes with 1,415 deaths. The Bismarck confirmed it 9 days later with 2,086 more. The sea keeps no legends. Only wrecks. Germany produced Bismarck at a cost of 198.8 million Reichsmarks. She was operational for exactly 9 days. She sank HMS Hood, killing 1,415 men, and damaged HMS Prince of Wales. In return, she was hunted by the entire British home fleet, struck by 2 torpedoes from Swordfish biplanes, bombarded into a burning wreck by 2 battleships, and sunk, by her own crew scuttling and British torpedoes combined, on May 27, 1941. The Royal Navy lost Hood and 1,415 men. Germany lost Bismarck and 2,086 men. Britain lost a ship it could not replace emotionally. Germany lost a ship it could not afford to lose strategically. Neither side gained anything commensurate with what it paid.